welcome back to another video. If you're new here, hi, I'm Olga and I make sewing content that is usually vintage inspired and sometimes a little bit nerdy. Today I'm going to be making some coveralls. I got this in the mail recently, new Burda style, or the one from March. It has this, coverall, overall, boiler suit, whatever you want to call it, pattern. I made it with like this real satiny fabric and I'm not a fan of that. I think it adds way too much drape to this. It looks like it has a lot of top stitching and all that. That's kind of what I wanted to do. I want to give it a little bit of a vintage vibe. I think maybe add some poofier sleeves. I have this gorgeous pink canvas from Minerva.com. It's their core range canvas, I believe, but I will be linking it below so you can go and find it. I love the color and I'm really excited about it. I also got some matching thread at the craft store, or like haberdashery, I guess. I also got some like brighter pink top stitching thread. I've never top stitched with top stitching thread before. It's gonna be fine. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna figure it out. Anyway, I have to go ahead and copy this pattern now.
First things first, I had to copy out the pattern. So I laid down some fabric, then some Christmas wrapping paper. And yes, it does have to be Christmassy for this to work. And then I placed my pattern sheet over top of that and used a tracing wheel to copy the markings. I added the seam allowances as instructed, except I never add the 4 centimeters of hem allowance that they suggest because I'm short and it's a waste of paper and fabric in my personal experience. The next day, I started cutting out my fabric using my cute wrapping paper pattern, and I actually had quite a bit of fabric left over, so I think I might get a little jacket or something out of it. But once I had all my pattern pieces cut out, I started transferring markings over onto the fabric. For most things, I use an awl to poke through the paper and then my friction pin to transfer the dots and connect them with the ruler. I also went ahead and cut out the interfacing for the front plackets and the collar and fused it to my fabric. My local fabric store didn't have the interfacing that I like, so I had to get a different one, but I will link the one that I usually use below. Then I switched my serger thread and serged all of the raw edges of the individual pieces. This will make it so I don't have to constantly switch machines later, plus with heavier weight fabrics and bigger garments, it can get a little challenging for me to physically maneuver stuff into the serger, so I decided to do it like this. The only seams that I didn't serge now were the hems of the trousers and the collars. And I also left the waistline of the back pieces of the trousers unserged because of the darts, I think, but it was kind of a silly reason looking back.
Hello, it's now the next day. I have all of my pieces cut out and serged for the most part. However, I was serging the back, like the back piece yesterday, and I realized I cut it wrong. So I cut it as if I cut it like this. This is the fold, and it's actually supposed to be like this. This should be the fold. And that makes way more sense. I thought it looked really weird, but I was trusting the process. I don't know if I made a mistake copying out the pattern because I was pretty sleepy when I did that, or if the pattern is wrong, but either way. And yes, I could sew it down the middle because I obviously added seam allowance, and that would kind of make it fine, but then this doesn't have any seam allowance and that will be problematic. So I'm gonna go ahead and recut this piece. I do have quite a bit of extra fabric left over, so it shouldn't be a problem. And I noticed something on the Burda instructions. I haven't made anything from like a more recent Burda magazine in a while, but their instructions are longer. The numbers are bigger and easier to understand, so like things are more divided into like paragraphs and things, where before it wasn't like this. They also include this list now, which is like, and it just tells you like what the order of the things you're going to be doing is without like all of the instructions, and then it explains it further down. Yeah, and it also has like a little title. So on one, for example, it says darts, and then it explains how you're going to sew the darts. The explanations I haven't like gone through properly. I only had like kind of glanced at it, but that just already seems a little bit like a big improvement on their instructions.
With that sorted out, I started pinning my darts. If you've watched more of my videos, you know that I love to do batch sewing, but sometimes when I'm sewing a new pattern or a certain type of garment for the first time, I try to more or less follow the instructions in terms of when to do things. I feel like batch sewing is a very helpful method, but it can add confusion and lead you to make mistakes if you're not confident in what you're making. I pinned the darts flat as always and stitch marked the pocket placement in case that the lines disappeared when I pressed my darts. Then I stitched them in place and pressed them. I'm doing both the front bodice darts and the back trouser ones in one go. Next, I started prepping the pocket. First, I folded the smaller pocket pieces down the middle and pressed them. Then I pressed in the seam allowance on the short edges and set them aside. For the bigger pocket pieces, I started by folding in the bottom edge by 3 centimeters and then pressing that in place. And then I pressed the seam allowances in on all the remaining edges. Now I could pin the pockets to the front bodice piece. The big pocket piece gets pinned along the lines that we marked on the fabric, and then the smaller piece gets pinned on top, but without overlap. So the folded edges should be flush with each other. I top stitched that in place using 2 rows of top stitching, but I did have to struggle with the thread for a bit first.
Okay, so that was definitely a process figuring out the top stitching. Figured out that I'm supposed to be using a different needle. I was using an 80 and I should be using at least 90 if not 100. It was better, but I still had some issues of the top thread starting to unravel and get stuck and break. I was having some both top and bottom tension issues, so sometimes I don't really know which way I need to go, if I need to tighten my tension or loosen it. So I test. Turns out I needed to tighten both my top and bottom tension threads. Now it's going great. Doesn't mean you're gonna have to do this. I've been having tension issues for the last couple of months. I do kind of regret not thinking ahead and doing some top stitching here at the opening of the pocket.
Okay, with the top stitching figured out and the pocket stitched in place, I moved on to the front yokes. Here the pattern says that we have to sew 1 layer of the front yoke now and then the inner layer later, which I thought was super weird and impractical, so I decided to go off-pieced. And yes, I know I said that I try to follow the pattern closely when I first do it, but the word try is very important in that sentence. Anyway, I pinned 1 layer of the yoke to each front bodice with right sides together, and then I pinned the right side of the second layer of the yoke to the wrong side of the front bodice. Effectively, I am sandwiching the front bodice piece in between the yoke pieces. I switched to my regular thread and stitched those seams, and then I pressed them. And there's also going to be a lot of switching between threads, just FYI. Speaking of which, I switched to the top stitching thread and I did 2 lines of top stitching along that seam. So if you've never used top stitching thread, it's a thicker kind of thread than the regular sewing thread that we usually use. You still want to use the same regular thread on the bottom bobbin, so I'm only actually switching my top thread. Like I said before, the needle also needs to be a bigger size because of the thickness of the thread. Next, I started putting together the back. I do the same yoke sandwich as I did for the front. The difference is that the back bodice piece needs a pleat at the center back since it's larger than the yoke. I think this is marked on the pattern, but I forgot to copy it, so I just made my own pleat and it worked out fine. I added my tag to the lining yoke piece before pinning it to the back bodice. Using regular thread, I stitched that in place, pressed it, and then switched threads to add 2 rows of top stitching. Next, I pinned the front and back together at the shoulder and sides. I stitched those seams with regular thread and pressed the side seams open and the shoulder seams back. Then, of course, I added some top stitching. For the shoulder seams, I added 2 rows on the side of the back yoke, but for the side seams, I did 1 row on each side of the seam. To keep my lines the same width on all the seams, I use the little lines on my presser foot as guides, and then I move my needle to one side or the other depending on the seam and what I need at that moment. Now I'm going off-pieced again and doing the collar and sleeves now. The pattern asks for it to be done after you add the trousers, and honestly that just feels like way too much fabric to be moving under the machine. So I'm doing it now. I'm pinning the collar with right sides together along the outer edges, and then I fold the non-interfaced collar piece seam allowance in on the neck edge. I did my sleeve gathering stitches along the shoulder using the longest stitch my machine does, but then I ended up not using them. Then I pinned the sleeves closed and stitched them along with the collar. Next, I trimmed the seam allowances on the collar, taking extra care around the corners. I pressed the sleeve seams open and then turned the collar right side out and pressed it flat. Because of the heavier weight of this fabric, I didn't get the corners as crisp as I'd like, but I moved on to top stitching the collar. Then I turned up the hem of the sleeves about 3 centimeters after trying them on, and then I hemmed that in place using my top stitching thread. I still thought the sleeves were too long, and then I did end up turning them over to form like a cuff, but if I ever want to wear them longer, I can. I found the center of the collar and matched it to the center back of the bodice to start pinning them together. I'm going to pin the interfaced layer to the bodice with right sides together, leaving the other edge free. I actually pressed that in after sewing the collar together, but I recommend you do it before. The collar is not going to reach all the way to the edge of the front, and that is how it's supposed to be. I stitched that in place, going slow and being careful to smooth the fabric as I go to avoid tucks and puckers. Then I trimmed the seam allowance except for the leftover area at the opening edges and pressed the seam allowance in to the collar. I went ahead and stitched the collar along the inside by hand, but in hindsight, I should have left it for later, and you'll see why. Next, I started pinning the sleeves to the bodice while simultaneously doing a horrendous job of staying in frame. Sorry about that. Sometimes the hyperfocus hits, what can I say? Anyway, I switched over to clips because the layers are adding up and this fabric is thick to start with, so I just find it easier to use clips in this kind of situation. And for the excess ease of the sleeve, as you know, I refuse to ease in a sleeve like a normal person, so I decided to do 3 little pleats because I thought it'd be cute. While it was cute, it was very annoying to get both sides to match exactly. I tried maybe like 4 or 5 times until I actually got it perfectly. I considered leaving it uneven, but then I just knew that that would annoy me every time I wear it, which if you think about it properly, it's going to be a long time cumulatively, so the 15 minutes I spent doing it here were worth it. Next, I stitched those seams in place and pressed them using the help of my tailor's ham, and the bodice is done for now, which means we can move on to the trousers. First, I'm pinning the front pieces of the trousers to the pocket lining along that diagonal line with right sides together. This is going to be the opening of the pocket. After I stitched them together, I pressed the seam allowances open and then pressed the pocket to the inside. Then I added 2 lines of top stitching along that seam. Next, I pinned the hip section piece to the pocket. This gets pinned along the kind of rounded edges, and it's how you actually form the pocket. I think this is a really neat pocket construction, and I always feel really clever when I sew pockets like this. Anyway, I stitched those down, making sure to leave the trouser fronts free. Moving on, I pinned each front trouser piece to a back piece with right sides together along the sides of the pockets. I stitched those in place and also pressed the seam allowances open off camera, which is much easier to do with longer pieces like these. Then I added some top stitching along the sides to match what I had done for the bodice side seams. In case you have a bad memory, that's 1 line of stitching on each side of the seam. Typically in jeans, they do this on the inner leg seams, but I feel like you see that less, plus it's much trickier to do, so I'm happy with my decision. Next, I pinned the inseams. Basically, you stitch like the crotch area, front with front and back with back. The front is going to end at the like little indent for the plackets. After stitching those seams together, I pressed them open with the help of my tailor's ham and a healthy dose of patience. And now we can stitch the inner legs together. I like to start by pinning my inseams together to make sure that they match, and then pin the rest of the legs down each side from there. I then stitched that together, pressed the seam allowances open. Finally, it's time to pin the bodice to the trousers. I start at the side seams to make sure that they're matching up nicely, and then I pin out from there. I found it easier to just stuff the bodice into the trousers, to be honest. And you know what? I stitched that in place. I took it slow so I could smooth my fabric and avoid tucks and puckers. And I serged those seam allowances together to make the waist less bulky and to like keep the seam allowances more contained. And obviously I pressed them up afterwards.
Update. Sewn the jumpsuit together, or at the waist. I decided not to add the belt loops because I also don't want to add the belt, and I feel like that was a good decision. I think I'm definitely going to wear it with belt, but I don't really use the belt loops most of the time because I don't like having the belt loops when I don't want to wear a belt, because then it feels like there's something missing. Whereas you can add a belt without belt loops, but you can't You know what I mean? All that's really left is to do the like button placket. I have to go read the instructions properly and, figure it all out. The pockets are so deep. So yeah, I'm really happy with them so far. Really, really happy that I'm gonna finish this just in time for the weather to get cold again. That's really exciting. Such a great time to be alive.
I cannot tell you how many times I read and reread these instructions, and it really didn't help at all. So let's watch me struggle for a bit. First, I pinned the plackets with right sides together so that I could stitch the top closed. I trimmed the seam allowance and clipped the corners, and then I pressed just the top, as this is what I thought the instructions were telling me to do. The jury's still out on that one. Then the instructions told me to add a 3 by 3 centimeter square of interfacing to the top of the trousers where the plackets were going to be stitched down, which I thought was weird timing because it would have been so much easier to do this at the start. Plus, if I add a square, it will mostly just go over the seam allowance, right? Well, I kind of just added some bits of interfacing to that general area to reinforce it and hoped for the best. My battery ran out, so I've gone ahead and done one of the sides of the little snap button placket to figure out what I wanted to do with it and kind of figure out what you're supposed to do with it. So this is what I got. I think it looks decent. Once I put this on, I understood why they told us to do the collar after. I'm just gonna unpick a little bit of my collar here that I did by hand, put that under, and call it a day. You really just tack that down. And I also went ahead and stitched this to each other, so they only tell you to stitch, from what my understanding or my interpretation of the instructions, they tell you to stitch this, but they don't tell you to stitch the bottom. I didn't do as much seam allowance, so it would actually be flush with where the trousers opening is. I understand how it's gonna overlap, but my question is then at the bottom here, where is that all gonna go? Nothing like hand sewing some things to hide your mistakes. Okay, so here's how I actually did the placket. Like I said, I started by stitching the bottom of the placket closed as well with a smaller seam allowance. I'm still unsure on whether or not this was a mistake, but maybe you can leave your thoughts in the comments to help me figure that one out. Then I pinned the placket to the front opening edge of the overalls and stitched it in place, being really careful around the collar to avoid having to use my seam ripper. I did one line of top stitching along the outer edge of the placket. I thought 2 was too much. I pressed the seam allowances towards the overalls off camera, and then I did 2 rows of top stitching along that seam on the side of the overalls. Now it was just a matter of figuring out how the bottom was going to work. As always, the instructions were unhelpful, and so I stared at the overalls for a long time, trying to use the force to make them reveal their secrets, but that didn't really help either. In the end, I unpicked some of the front seam. I clipped the corners on the trousers and then tried sewing the bottom edge of the placket to the edge of the trousers. I thought there wasn't enough fabric for each placket to be sewn to each trouser top edge. What I actually did was I stitched both the top trouser edges to the one placket. I chose to sew it to the back placket, or the one that goes under when I overlap them to close the overalls, but in hindsight, I probably should have done it the other way around. I did most of this with hand sewing, and it's not perfect, but it's as close as I could get it to be. With that figured out, it was on to finishing touches. Basically, doing the hem and the snaps. For the hem, I didn't like the top stitching. I thought it looked weird for some reason, so I ended up using hemming web. And for the snaps, I used these adorable pink heart-shaped snaps, and I used an awl to poke through the fabric on the top placket, and through that hole I mark where the snap needs to go on the bottom placket. That way the snaps will always line up. Then I put the snaps in place and tightened them with this contraption plier thing. I can try and link you to a similar one, but honestly I got this one from Lidl, the supermarket, so I'll try and find something similar. And finally, we're ready for the reveal.
Okay, so wrap up time. I'm really happy with it. I think it looks so cute. I love the little sleeve details that I added instead of like easing the sleeve in. I think the top stitching looks really, really great, and I'm really happy that I did it. I think I would like to taper the trouser for a future iteration. I think this is fine. I think I like a little bit more of a tapered look. It's not even that I don't think they look good on me or anything like that. I just find it really hard to style with shoes. So that's my issue with that. And obviously figure out the construction of this placket better. Burda patterns, am I right? I'm really happy with it overall. I think it was a fun project. Let me know what your thoughts are. Did you have fun watching / maybe making your own version of this? Are you going to? If you enjoyed that video and you'd like to see more of me trying to turn modern patterns into vintagey inspired ones, then you should subscribe because I do that pretty much every week. Consider following me on Instagram or TikTok. I post on there pretty much every day. I usually post like updates of my projects that I'm working on. I post little tips and tricks. So yeah, maybe that's a good place to follow me, particularly on Instagram, because I do post on my stories and stuff, and I can share with you what I'm doing, and sometimes you get photos of the dog as well. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!